Jesus, there's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you, Lord. We adore you. There is no sinner beyond the infinite stretch of your mercy. How can we thank you enough for how you have loved us completely? Jesus, there's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you, Lord. All we have, all we need, all we want is you. All we have, all we need, all we want is you. All we have, all we need, all we want is you. Jesus, there's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you. There's no one like you. Jesus, we love you, ever adore you, Lord. There's no one like you.
Holy Father, thank you for an opportunity again to study. I ask for again your blessing upon every one of these people who made that effort to come and sit. And I pray that I can teach well, bring my mind to bear on the task, bring their minds to bear as well. Also for those who are sick or just simply so overwhelmed with busyness, grant them grace as they persevere through this week. Show us the way that you bring mercy to us each day so that we might delight in that. We ask in your son's name. Amen. We'll wait for Bob. All right, so anybody have questions? Warning, my brain is off today, so you ever have those days where, yeah, Kim and I are actually asking ourselves, is this just us getting older or what? We don't know. But yeah, I take that as a good sign that but yeah, I just, the cylinders aren't all firing. Anyhow, questions? You were supposed to ask them, but did you write it down so that you wouldn't forget it? Say it louder. Oh, that's right. And what happens to them? Yeah, so that's right. We talked about that while you were doing the communion stuff. So, what do you do with a person who professes faith? I'm going to say it that way: a person that claims Christ but commits suicide. Um, the simplest answer is they're in the presence of Christ. Um, there are some groups, and the Roman Catholic Church would be one of them, that would say that that is a mortal sin and that you go straight to hell. Um, and so there is no possibility of salvation. The problem is the Bible just doesn't give that, and so it would be a grievous sin. And yet there's also, yeah, I mean, we can go off into all kinds of what ifs and what ifs, but the Bible just doesn't give, well, that one's the unforgivable sin or something like that. So that would be the answer. Yeah, my very first funeral was a suicide. You show up here, and a few months later, remember? Yeah, because you came over, and Tim went with me to that. He and I were talking. Tim Stalker, he was at my office, and we were just talking. I got the phone call, and I'm like, "Let's go." I'm thinking, I'm at what, 34? I have no idea what I'm going to do. And the father was Mort's friend, and then Mort showed up, and this guy just fell into his arms, and they both fell to the ground. He just held them, and his son was not a Christian, and he killed himself. And I'm like, okay. So that made that hard because his father knew that was it.
What made it harder for him too, he was sharing the gospel with his son.
Yep. It's just, I've seen enough of them. It's heartbreaking. Other questions? Well, you're all as active as I am. No questions? Yes, ma'am. No, don't apologize.
Why did, when Gideon delivered Israel, why did he use a sheep's fleece?
Okay, when Gideon delivered Israel, then I couldn't hear you.
When Gideon delivered Israel, why did he use a sheep's fleece for a sign?
The skin of the fleece, because that's what he had. I mean, why did Gideon lay out the fleece, the sheepskin, right?
Yeah, why did he want God to first time to make the fleece wet and the ground dry?
And then the second time make the fleece dry and the ground wet, right? Why? Well, the simplest answer, that's the easy one to actually answer, and that's a good one. That was simply he's being asked to do something very, very difficult, and he, instead of just trusting God like he was supposed to, he questioned God, and he's like, well, wait a second, I need to make sure you're really serious. So he asked, I mean, in that day, they would have sheepskins. I mean, they use them for blankets and clothing and everything. So I'm just going to lay this out, and then you do this miracle, right? You make it wet and the ground dry, and if that's it, then I know it's from you. And then when it happened, he still didn't really believe God, right? So he says it the second time, and finally he believed God. It was just because he's just like you and I. We like to think that we have a lot of faith. We think that we really believe God, but then when God actually asks you to obey in something difficult, yeah, you're not so good at it, right? It's actually a lot of people, I'll talk to the room at large now, use that as an example of how to make decisions. And in our podcasts on how to make decisions, we talk about it, but it's actually bad. But it's very common. People who will say, God, if you really want me to do this, have a robin come to my window tomorrow or whatever. And what they're doing is they're interpreting these signs that these are all evidence of that God's leading. God is very kind, and sometimes will actually bring those things about in spite of the fact that it's not ever proper to do. That's actually a process. Do you know what sin that actually is? Unbelief. No, well, yeah, it is unbelief, but divination. Yeah, it's forbidden. You're trying to divine the mind of God, and you're saying, okay, I think this is what God's will is, and I don't know. And so they're trying through different means to do that. And so they ask God, show me this sign or show me that. And they set the parameters. And even though sometimes God will show a lot of kindness in that, that's never commanded. And I've had to help people undo the mess they got themselves into because they just knew that God had guided them that way through these various signs. The only sure way you know the will of God is the Word of God, and that's it. And so if you struggle with how to make decisions, we would really encourage you to listen to that series. Just look up decision making on the podcast, and we go through it. It used to be a class I taught, and Matt thought it'd be useful just to put there. So strongly encourage you to do it, especially if you got a major decision, because a lot of the methods that people talk about are horrible. But bottom line, that story, Claire, is a story of God's grace and patience rather than the faith of Gideon. Gideon's faith was poor, but God was still very kind to him, which is good because we're all somewhat dumb. Yeah, I think I've told you, did I tell you the story about me sticking my finger in the Bible? Yeah, so I tell this story. People who've been here for a while know it, but I had a bad accident. My leg was pulled off at the knee, and I was in, you can imagine, incredible pain. And my whole life, as I understood it, at almost 18 years of age, came to an end. And I was in my bed after they did what they could for it, and couldn't sleep. And so it was 2 or 3 days of no sleep at all. The pain meds didn't work, nothing. And I was just frantic. And I was a foolish young man. I was in sin. I was doing all kinds of dumb things. In fact, I was in the process of going to see my girlfriend that my father had already told me, you need to stop seeing. And I was on my way to go see her when I hit the car. And so I was not some some example of great faith. I was just a foolish 17-year-old is what I was. And but I was desperate. I was going crazy. If you've ever not gone for sleep for a day or two, any mother should know what I'm talking about. You start thinking you're losing your mind. And I just picked up my Bible, and I didn't know what to do. And I just said, God, I don't know what to do, but would you show me what I should do? And I opened my Bible randomly, stuck my finger down, and this is really deep spiritual stuff. And it landed on James chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, if any of you fall into various trials, count it nothing but joy. And I'm like, ah. And so mine was the Living Translation back then. And so it said, when you fall into hardships, be happy. And so I'm like, I can't be happy. But I knew that's what he commanded. And so as best I remember, I said, God, I don't know how I can be happy about this, but I'll smile. I will smile. I don't know, I hurt, but I'll smile. And I smiled, and weirdly enough, the pain all went away. And I fell asleep for the first time. When I came back, the pain was never, it was bad, but it was never like that. Again, what's that? That's a testimony of God's kindness. That's not a method that I now employ when you come to me for counsel. I'm like, well, let's see what God has to say. And go out and hang yourself. Don't do that. So, okay, there was another, Tom?
Just raised my hand. There's somebody else.
And I'm the teacher, so I picked you.
Okay, so 2 Thessalonians 2:3 talks about the man of lawlessness. Seems like that's the Antichrist. Just wondering why is he called the man of lawlessness in particular?
Why? Because that's what.
I mean, like in what sense though? Like he's against the Ten Commandments. He is against the laws of man.
No, he's without law. It literally is. There is no law within him. He is opposed to all things that would be in accordance to God's ways, which is the epitome of the Antichrist, right? You have Christ, and then the Antichrist is literally just flip that exact opposite. So, and yes, you are, I believe you're correct. The man of lawlessness there is speaking of it. Okay. You had your hand up?
Did Judas go to heaven after
No, he didn't. Judas did not. Judas was a false believer, and he went to hell. Good question. Sad question, but anything else? He was called the son of perdition. And Christ always knew he was going to betray him, and he knew what he was. Again, Judas is a good example of also how just the common grace. You think about how many times Christ showed grace, kindness to him, and in fact, and yet knowing the whole time that he was the one who would betray him. Also, what's interesting with him is that he would have been one of the disciples when Christ sent out the disciples. They sent them out 2 by 2, and they were able to perform all of those miracles. They could cast out demons, they could heal the sick, they could do anything by the power of Christ. And there was Judas doing that, even though he was not an actual believer. And so again, it's one of the things I emphasize over and over again. Every time you look at a person who claims to do amazing miracles, and they even claim to do it in the name of Christ, it means absolutely nothing. The only thing that matters is what do they testify to be true about Jesus Christ. That's all that matters. Everything else is just window dressing. So, good question. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Well, I remember reading in our day reading plan, and I can't remember what verse, and then there's this
Leviathan?
Leviathan.
The Nephilim?
Yeah. So my question is, who are
Nephilim.
these warriors or giants in Genesis
6.
4?
Yes, that's in Genesis 6. And who are the Nephilim? There's all kinds of views, but I'll tell you my view, which of course is the right view. So actually it's translated, it's not actually translated, that's actually the Hebrew word, because it's really hard to know exactly what is meant by it, okay? There's just not a lot to go on. But the context of it was the fact that it says the sons of God went into with the daughters of men, and then they produced the Nephilim. And so the sons of God, that's a phrase in the Bible that's used for both angels and demons. And then the daughters of men would be women. And they came together and actually made babies. And these were like a crazy half-breed kind of wicked offspring. That's my position, which is the oldest position. Others say these were just some really strong guys, and they were hard, fierce warriors, and they were known as that. and that is most likely why this is beyond. But that's who I believe they were. Okay, to the rest of you at large, have you guys ever wondered why the people of Canaan had to be utterly wiped out? I mean, there's just no mercy shown to them at all. If you as you read, you'll find that after the flood and everybody was wiped out, the one place where the Nephilim are again mentioned is in Canaan. And they were very wicked in their worship practices and everything else, and it's very possible that they had revived that same thing, and they were so it's the same idea of now this was prevalent throughout the earth before the flood, and afterwards these people had revived that. So he just was like, we'll just have them all wiped out. So, yes, ma'am.
A follow-up question to that. When you preached on that a long time ago, I think it was Sunday nights.
It was.
It seems like there was a grammatical issue that you pointed out.
Oh, goodness, that was
I know. I thought maybe you would. It would be. And it seems
in
like
verse 4.
yeah, it seems like it was about the and also afterward. I think that's.
Yeah, the afterward.
Is that what you were just referring to?
That's what I was referring to, is that we had these Nephilim, and they were during that time, but then they also came and showed back up, and where did they come from? By the way, other people argue this is where aliens are, and aliens came down and did things. Boy, that's going way back. I actually still remember that because I created quite a stir.
Yeah, I can't remember. That might have been what it was. I can't remember.
Oh, there was several stirs I created. I remember them because I got yelled at. Anyone else? Yes.
Is that why Goliath was so big?
Yes, actually, I can't prove this, but I, not just him, all of his brothers, they're all giants.
So they were kind of like
And yeah, that in fact, many people believe that that's where the concept of a demigod came out of. It would involve me getting into a whole thing I don't have the ability to do. I would now, and I certainly couldn't do it off the top of my head. I would say if you're interested in thinking through some of that, in my series through Ephesians, at the very, very beginning, I deal with this, I think it's 3 or 4 parts called The Real Reality. And I deal with the fact that we tend to only look at what we see. And I reference Francis Schaeffer, if I remember correctly. He talked about that the modernist, going back to our conversation, the modernist will only see this half of an orange. And everything's all about this half of an orange. And his point is that, yeah, but there's another half that you can't see. And you have to understand that. And that's the real reality. We keep saying that everything we see and experience and know is reality. And then that's all faith. That's something else. That's not reality. That's out here. But in reality, everything seen and unseen is reality. And it's all under the hand of God. And part of that is this whole realm of demonic spiritual work. And so I take the church through many, many passages starting way back in Genesis and show all of these weird passages that we kind of read about, and then we're like, huh, and then we just keep going and just show how not only is there this angelic and demonic reality, but there's also those rankings. So you have angels and archangels, then you have these subgroups of angelic beings like the seraphim and the cherubim, and that they're not the same as an archangel, and they don't seem to be just an angel. And so you're like, there's this whole world that we don't see, and they're all just doing their thing. Well, one second, but in Daniel is one of the best passages when Daniel has Michael come to him. He's like, I would have been here. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, okay? This is a Matt Henry translation. I would have been here sooner, but the Prince of Persia held me up. You're like, wait, what? And I always thought that was a video game. And it wasn't. And it's like, tell me more about this Prince of Persia. And that was apparently, and then he had to go deal with the Prince of Greece as well. And so you have these, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and yet they weren't talking, he wasn't talking about a physical being. Nothing, no man is going to hold up Michael. You're just not going to do it. And so it gives this idea that there are, you may have heard of territorial angels or territorial demons or territorial spirits. I think that it goes way beyond what we can talk about, but it does seem that God has created spiritual beings that have responsibility over parts of the world. And that was part of the rebellion in the beginning of the fallen angels, that they were supposed to, the psalmist, it's in the 80s, I'm pretty sure. That's pretty vague. But if you go to my sermon, the sermons, they're all there, where they are to be judges, and they're supposed to oversee the doings of the world and mete out works of righteousness. But instead, they rebel and they instead corrupt, and they will become judged by God. So what you have is you have this whole world that we don't always see and what's really going on.
Going back to the classification of angels, it seems like Moses knew what, I can't remember if it's a seraphim or a cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant.
Well, he was given plans, so we don't know. I mean, he was actually given, right? He was given that plan on what he's supposed to do for the tabernacle, and part of it was having those cherubim and their wings outstretched over the top. So I'm assuming either he was shown what they look like, or that was part of the plans upon which he then had the tabernacle made. We don't know enough. I do know that the seraphim that Isaiah saw was frightening. In fact, there's never once a place where an angel shows up and everyone's encouraged. It's always a rather frightening moment. Okay? That's a fascinating subject, but you can also go weird. Yes, ma'am.
We talked about this a little bit in the book study on Wednesday on Antigone. Do you think there's anything to like the Greek gods, all that
Yes.
mythology, and that they're actually demons?
Yes. Do I think there's anything to do about anything about the idea of the mythology and whether they're demons, right? I'm just repeating for this. I think so. I have to be very careful, but I do think so. I think that that's where a lot of this idea of how close the spiritual realm and the physical realm is, and how they intersect, and that there's these weird ways that they intersect. And I think very much so that there's some, but I think it's way beyond what, I would never go to a Greek mythology and see, so that's how all of this works. I do believe though that there's origins. I mean, when you trace these things, you start seeing that there's these commonalities all the way through. The same thing with, I always get laughed at on this one, but like dragons. And we immediately picture whatever we picture as a dragon, but that's what literally is meant by the serpent speaking to Eve. And what's very interesting was he is the most, crafty of the creatures. And I always found it interesting that Eve was not bothered that she's talking to him. And so, the idea that here is this creature, and it's not just a little snake, is speaking to her, and through that he is being empowered by Satan, we find according to Revelation. But you go through human history. In fact, I think the creation science guy that was here, he talked about that throughout. I'm like, hey, all right, another guy just like me who's wacky. But it is nice. But I mean, you can trace it throughout human history, the commonalities of those things, and and also the common attributes. And yet these are wildly divergent cultures, and yet we can trace that. I find that whole thing is very, very fascinating. I have to be careful because, again, you can go down a rabbit hole and never come back up.
I had a hard time in high school and college studying those because it really felt blasphemous, to me. And so I really just kind of like, I read it because you had to, but I had a really hard time just
Sure.
interacting with it and enjoying it for even literature's sake.
Somebody else had a hand?
If they have their realm, the spirits, the demons, the
Right.
angels, all these things, and they're free doing whatever they're doing, why do demons want to occupy or be present in someone? Like, you hear of
Meaning, if they're free to go do what they want, why do they, like, take possession of a human? Well, I don't know. That's what demons do. I mean, seriously, I don't know. And not all do, but some seem to take control of humans, and it's called, but we don't even know exactly what that means. In that, I mean, because it's not like something you can watch or see or understand fully. The actual term is to be demonized, and we translate usually demon possessed, but it's that you're under the power and control or influence of the demon. And why? Because they're, I mean, at the very core, because they're opposed to everything about God, and every human being is an image bearer of God. And so we're all, even in our fallen state, we're always displaying the glory of God. And I'd say that would be the simplest thing. And so they're opposed to him and his ways. Yes, sir?
You know why there was a dispute over the body of Moses?
Okay, so out of Jude, Michael is arguing with Satan over the body of Moses. Why? I can give you an educated guess. That's one of those passages you're like, again, let's back up. I got questions, and it doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you about that. And I think that the battle was because when he died, Michael's job was to go ahead and take the body. And I mean, obviously, right? But the reason was so that Moses' body would not be capable of becoming an idol. Because one thing that Israel was really, really good at is taking something good and turn it into an idol. So the brazen serpent would be a good example. They're in trouble. The serpents are biting them. He has that erected. All you have to do is look upon it, and you'll be healed. And then later on, you find that they had to destroy it because it turned into a new idol. So that's my suspicion, and that's what Satan was trying to do. And if you ever have you ever been to a Romanian Orthodox church? Did they have any dead bodies in there, mummified? Yeah, I in Romania, I went to a major, I don't know, I guess, are they churches or I don't even know that. Well, this thing was a famous one, and I went in there, and they had 2 or 3 dead saints, and people are kissing them. Yeah, they had worn through their skin, and there was a bone, and it's just a line all the way out the door and down the block. And I'm like, I got in the line because I'm like, okay, I'm a good American. You get in the line and wait your turn. And they're like, no, that's for people who want to kiss the dead guy. I'm like, what? And so we just went past them and went into the church. Sure enough, they're all going by this casket and this dude, and they're kissing them, and they're trying to work off their sins and hoping that he'll bless them. And then they go over to this priest who had these palm fronds. Have you ever seen that? Look it up under Orthodox Church baptisms. You'll get different kinds. And this one, they use palm fronds, and he's dipping them, like 5 or 6 of them, into this big vat of water, and he's just flinging it as hard as he can, and it's like it's a water park. Everyone's like trying to get the water on them. And they're just getting soaked, and I'm like, what is going on? And but they're just doing their circuit. Yeah. So my point is, these guys are worshiping these dead bodies, and that's exactly what would have happened with Moses. So, wow, we just went weird completely here. Who started this? Which question was it that we can blame? It was my grandson. Well done. These are fun ones. Okay. Anything else, or do you want to get one more? She's the last, so don't build off of hers.
Okay, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but what is sanctification?
Sanctification is, you're saying it perfect. It simply means, well, depending, but primarily in the Bible it will be used in growing in holiness. That's literally what it means. Okay? Another way is to be set apart. So in one way, we are already sanctified. So when the Bible says that we've been set apart through the Spirit, that's sanctified. That we've been literally set apart out of this domain of darkness into the domain of light and life in Christ. So in one sense, we're already sanctified. And then the process of sanctification is simply you beginning to put away the things that do not fit you as a Christian and begin to put on the things that fit what a Christian ought to be. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's go to Hebrews. Anyone know where we left off? I want to say it was verse 7. Phew. Yes? Okay. Well, I'm not trusting you, Bob, so I'm looking for, I mean, I love you, but yeah, you're older than me. And all right, so we're dealing with, what is the subject matter of Hebrews 11? Faith, yeah. It's all about faith. And if you remember verse, what was it? 39 of chapter 10, which really belongs in chapter 11. You guys know that the verses and the chapters are not part of the Bible. They were, I can't remember, do you remember when they were put in? Was it the 1600s, I want to say, yeah. It was not that long ago, relatively speaking. And so, but they're here. And so in verse 39, it's really still part of the what we would call this chapter. We are not those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith to the persevering of the soul, which is the whole point of Christ is superior, so persevere, don't fall away. And so he connects this staying faithful and persevering with faith. And so now he's just going to unwrap what does faith look like, and he's using examples out of that every Hebrew would know. Everyone knows these things because they all grew up hearing these stories. And so we now move in chapter 11, verses 8 down to 22. He deals with a whole chunk that's the time of the patriarchs. Okay, so if you're making some kind of outline, he's going to examine what faith looks like in the time of the patriarchs. When I say patriarch, what do I mean? What's a more common word for patriarch? Fathers, yeah. And who are they? There's three. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Sorry, I knew you knew it, sweetheart, but yes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob's other name? Israel, right? Okay. So, first of all, we look at Abraham's faith. And I want you to see in verses 8 through 10, just shout out. But once you shout one out that you think is correct, then just let others. What are some ways that his faith is seen in 8 through 10? Yeah. Okay, but build on that. It's obedience, but how is that obedience seen? Build on that. Just you. In other words, just read the next few words.
By going out to a place which he was received for an inheritance.
Yes. All right. So he obeyed by going out to this place, right? So that's the very first thing. He left his land for an inheritance, but he had no idea where that thing was going to be at. But he obeyed. What's the next one? Not knowing where he was going, yes. What's the next one?
He lived as an alien
Okay, he lived as an alien. Build on that.
in the land of promise as a foreign land. He dwelled in tents with Isaac and Jacob.
Okay, yes. Let me change the wording a little bit. So he lived as an alien, and if he's going to live as an alien in this land, what does that tell you about that land in relationship to him?
It wasn't his homeland.
Yes, it was not just wasn't his homeland, it was never his land, right? He went there because God said, I'm going to show you this. I'm going to make you a great nation. And he dwelt in the land, but he always was a stranger in that land. That was never his. And that's the aspect of the faith, though. It takes a lot of faith to live your whole life in the land that is being said it's yours, but you never get it. And yet you keep believing that it's yours because God said so. And then one more thing in verse 9. This one you'll have to think a little bit more, perhaps.
God gave the people a foundation to build on.
That's in verse 10, and yes, but let's stay with verse 9. What else in verse 9? There's another thing.
Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise.
Okay, yeah, hang on here. Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. So that's the answer, but what's that telling us about Isaac and Jacob?
For he was looking forward to the city with firm.
Okay, yep, but we're not in verse 10 yet. So yes, you and Claire are both right on that one. But I want you to, okay, Abraham lived there. He dwelt as an alien, but he believed God that this was the promised land. And then who else received those promises?
Isaac and Jacob.
Isaac and Jacob. And how did they, and what does that mean?
That they was living in a foreign land, dwelling in tents.
Yeah, it might be too hard. Yeah, he told them, or whoever it was. Yeah, they were raised in this. They were, okay, you see these multiple generations of Abraham was faithful to raise his sons in these promises. Granted, God also then as an adult, each one of them also had God reaffirm that covenant with them. But it wasn't like the first time they heard of, what, really? I didn't know that. Well, these were men raised in the faith. And for me as a father, that's a wonderful thing. And it's even more wonderful when you watch your grandchildren being raised in that faith and trying to create that multiple generation of faith and hope. So what stands out in this whole story of Abraham is that he continued to hold on to the promise of God, even though everything seemed to indicate that they would not be fulfilled. That's what makes Abraham so amazing. The whole time then in verse 10, he was looking to a land, beyond that land though, to a future eternal land. And it's described as a land with a city, right? That has foundations whose architect and builder is God. Now, what do you think, somebody who hasn't answered yet, what do you think he's referencing there? And it's a hard one. No peeking at notes in your study Bible. It's a hard question, so. And if you not sure, what do you think? This would be a great place to give a guess. Jerusalem. Okay. Why Jerusalem? Just out of curiosity.
It's the city of David. Just throwing that out there.
Okay. No. Okay. That's actually one view. I don't think it is, but I could also be wrong. It's hard to be absolutely specific. What's another guess, maybe? Yes, sir.
The only city I think that has foundations would be the New Jerusalem.
So the New Jerusalem. Okay. That's very possible too. Some will say heaven, which they would include the New Jerusalem. Others would say, this one comes out of a Greek philosophy, Platonic thought, that he's referencing some kind of a spiritual city that isn't physical in any way, shape, or form. I think that one's poor. I tend to think of it as the new heavens and earth, where all of this is remade and built by God, but at the centerpiece would be what you just said, New Jerusalem, that descends out of heaven, right? And it's there, and this is where all the nations for all eternity come and worship. So, and I could be wrong, but it's a hard one. Go to 1 Peter, keep your finger there, but go to 1 Peter 1:1. I just want to show you that we are called to be the same way as Abraham. 1 Peter 1:1, first verse of 1 Peter. You got it? You want to read it, Matthew?
Sure.
Okay, read it loud.
From Peter, an apostle.
Oh, wow, dude, I got hard words in here. You want to read those?
I made a little mistake.
Okay, you go for it. I just gave you the worst. No. You got hard words coming up. You want me to read this one? No, you want to go for it? Go for it. I'll
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those temporarily residing abroad in Pontus,
Galatia.
Galatia,
Galatia, Cappadocia.
the province of Asia, and
Bithynia, very good.
who are chosen.
Okay, that's it. Just that. So your translation said as temporary what?
To those temporarily residing abroad.
Temporarily residing abroad. That's an odd, what translation is that? That's a net? Wow. Okay. I mean, it's correct. Mine is aliens, as aliens. And so what he's saying is, look, I'm writing this letter to you who are temporarily residing abroad. You're living in a land that is not yours. But what's he talking about there? What kind of land what is the land that we're living in? Huh? Well, when you say this, what? This earth. Actually, yeah, he's not talking about a specific country. He's actually talking about the fact that we dwell in a land called earth that's not ours. We're aliens. We're temporarily living here. And we are by faith commanded to see that and dwell as if we don't belong here. It doesn't mean we can't plant gardens and we can't build and we can't live and enjoy and all that, but we always have to hold all of it very loosely because this is not where our hope lies. Does that make sense? And so we're really no different than Abraham in that sense. In some ways, ours is pretty hard, a little bit harder because you're born and raised here, right? And as you're putting your roots down and you're seeing multiple generations. And yet the whole time you have to fight. And I would argue you have to fight with yourself to believe and remind yourself, this is not my home. And it's easier for you to believe that when you're under great oppression. And it's hard to believe that when your life is very comfortable. I was actually talking to Linda a week or so ago, and we were talking about the Negro spirituals. And a lot of those, their songs are pointing to that day when they're finally with God, when they're finally in the presence of Christ. And why? Well, because they're in a terrible situation in their slavery. And so they had this great hope to look beyond that. So,
Pastor, in verse 9 there, as in a foreign land is what my translation says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9.
okay.
That says to me, too, that he doesn't know anything there. He doesn't know maybe how things go, how to do things, how...
No.
And things are just so strange, and I feel sometimes that way in our
in our culture. Yes, I think that's a fair statement, especially as our nation continues to go more wacky. So, okay, next. So that was Abraham. Now he looks at his wife, Sarah. She was also, it says in verse 11, a woman of faith. So by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So what was the ability, or what was the basis for her ability to conceive a child, become pregnant? Well, it was by faith, but why? She didn't obey God. Not there. What's your name? Jay.
Because her husband believed.
No. Look at verse 11.
Because it was the proper time?
Nope. Because it wasn't the proper time. She was way old. Yeah, notice the word since. Some of you, you'll have the word because. Okay, depending how they translated that word. Why she herself received the ability to conceive, and then we'll just skip that one phrase because that is not necessary, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So it was that she believed that God would do this, and that was the basis. So where was her faith focused on? Was it the baby? Was it pregnancy? Then what was it? His promise. His promise, in that it's God that gave that promise, and he's faithful. And this is the thing I was trying to emphasize last week, and I'll do it again this week, is faith is always established, the object, what we focus on in our faith is always God. And what has he promised? That God is faithful to his promises. Now, over time, those things can change. Like for Sarah, it was to believe that God would be faithful to his promise. For us, it's that we are called to believe that Christ is the one who's sent by the Father, that he is our sacrifice. He has dealt with that through his death and resurrection, and that by trusting ourselves to him, we not only are forgiven, but we will have life. Does that make sense?
The NET says the verse is about Abraham, not Sarah.
What?
The NET says the verse is about Abraham.
No way.
Yeah, it says he and she.
Hang on, let me bring up the net just to see why.
What did Jace just say?
He said the NET, the New English Translation. Wow, look at that. All right, hang on here. Yeah. Yeah, I'll read it. By faith, even though Sarah herself was barren and he was too old, he received the ability to procreate because he regarded the one. I'm betting there, I know why they did. I just want to see it. And it's not a typo. That was, and it's not something I'm going to get into. Oh, come on. I'll explain it, but I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole there either. I'm looking at the translator's notes for the New English translation, and they're not giving me anything to work with. And I'm looking at the Greek, and it's not giving me, I don't know where they got that from. I expected them to reference, you know your Bible is a translation, right? And so, and it's drawn out of a bunch of different manuscripts of Greek and Hebrew, and sometimes the translation staff will choose an alternative rendering because they have thousands of manuscripts, and and they'll look and say, no, we think that these are more trustworthy of the transcripts than these, and that's what I expected from there, but it's not making any reference of that, which is annoying.
It says God promised Abraham a son, but Sarah died.
Yeah, I understand, but I mean, I'm looking at the Greek,
Right.
the Greek New Testament, and I don't know where they got that, so that's not helpful. Sorry, guys.
Isn't that where Sarah laughed? Is that the doubt or?
I don't know. That again, I'm not going to worry about any of those. That's not when we're dealing with translation. None of that matters. Only thing that matters is what does the Greek or Hebrew actually say, and I cannot see. So that's very interesting. If you guys want to send a text or preferably an email to me, I'd actually like to look into it a little bit more. Yes, sir. Yes. Oh. All right, I'll thank you for that. Then if you, yeah, it's a rabbit hole that we can go down. Oh, really? Okay, yeah. Please don't. Okay, so back to ignoring that little oopsie. The result of Abraham and Sarah's faith, though, is we have this bringing forth of what nation? Israel, right. Because of the lack of Abraham's faith and Sarah's faith, we brought forth what nation? Ishmaelites, who became the Arab nations, right? And so there you go. Okay, was the promise of God contingent? This is a question you got to think about, so don't answer real quick unless you know absolutely. Was the promise of God contingent upon the faith of Abraham and Sarah? You say no. Why?
I remember the covenant when Abraham had to do the sacrifices and split them in half.
So you remember the making of the covenant where it was all God doing it and Abraham just was asleep.
Yeah, in order for that covenant to go both ways, he would have had to walk through it, but God actually made him.
Right, so it wasn't a bilateral, it's called a bilateral covenant versus a unilateral, meaning only one party is responsible to keep it. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Anyone else want to take the opposite way? Don't say I'm not raising my hand for nothing. I actually take it the other way. The covenant with Abraham itself was a unilateral covenant between where God said, I will do these things. But the giving of the child of promise to Sarah, the text says it's because she trusted or believed that he was faithful, or if you're the net, that he believed he was faithful to do it. That's the contingency. So a subset of that covenant, there was a contingency there. And this gets into things that we won't get into here. I'll just make mention. You look at, people struggle like, well, is Israel really the chosen nation of God or not? They sure don't seem to be, but the Bible keeps calling them that. And there's a difference between being a covenant people, where God has made a covenant with a people, and the fact that people within that group never receive the blessings of the covenant, okay? Meaning, the only way you can receive the blessings of a covenant or the promises of a covenant is if you obey. And the obedience in Israel's case requires them to do what? It's this whole chapter. Have faith. In who? In God. And they don't. In fact, sorry, my mind's already going on to my sermon that I'll be preaching, Lord willing, this week about that very issue, is that they don't believe and they reject and they will not trust in God's promises over and over again. So over and over again, the people of Israel were saved out of Egypt. He made that point really clear in Hebrews, right? And yet they all then died in the wilderness because of unbelief. So they never received the promise of even going into the promised land. Those people never received it, but Israel received it, right? Because as a nation, it's bigger than just whoever happens to be alive as Israel at that moment. And so God was still faithful to his promise, and yet the people who enjoyed that and received those promises were the ones of faith. So guys like Caleb and whatnot. Does that make sense? And that would be what's happening here, is that this part is contingent, even though the covenant of that God was not contingent, if that makes sense.
I have a question about that.
Okay.
About sovereignty of God.
Okay.
So.
You got a question about the sovereignty of God? No, I'm doing it for this.
Okay. Isn't it he who gives them the ability to have faith?
Theologically, yes, but that's not in the text.
I don't decide to have faith in the
Yes, you do.
The Holy Spirit
Yes, you do.
changes my heart.
Yes, he does.
And then I respond.
And yes, you do. Yes. So, yes. So when we're talking theologically, you're correct. God gives me this faith. Christ is my author and my finisher of my faith, okay? And there's other passages that would indicate that. That's all fine and well, but there is also the reality that the Bible makes it very clear that we are called to believe, and we do believe. Now, the theological question is, why do we believe? What is it that happened that made us believe? Because if you've ever met somebody who sat in church, let's say, listening to sermons for years, and then also one day the light turns on, they're like, I believe this. What happened? You know, it's not like the sermon was extra good that Sunday. What happened was God worked and changed their heart. But because the heart was changed, what they used to instinctively, naturally reject, they now naturally believe. And so when a person tells me, don't tell me that I'm chosen by God, I believed, I don't argue with them. I'm like, you're right, you did believe. And I try to get that off the table because I want to take them further back to, but why did you believe? Not whether you did or not. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so where are we at? 13 through 16. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to call them their God, and He has prepared a city for them. What's the point? Say what?
No matter what they went through, they still had faith in God.
That's really good. No matter what they went through, they still had faith in God. That's real good. Let's go a little further, but that's real good. Whatever your name is, granddaughter of mine. Claire. That their faith will bring them to heaven. Yes, that's good too. So we're so far we're right there doing good. Let's see if we can build a little bit more, Bob.
Without receiving the promise.
Said, but okay. So what do you take from the idea that they never received the promise that they were believing in? Linda, can you restate what you said? I can't remember exactly the wording. I don't.
Said no matter what they went through, they still had faith.
Yeah, no matter what they went through, they still had faith. She was saying that they were hoping or had faith in heaven. I think it was something like that. And you just said, what?
They didn't receive it.
They didn't receive it. So what does that tell you? He's applauding them. He's applauding them.
Faith that they have for not receiving it, yet they still had.
Nope. You want to try?
Well, that their faith manifested hope.
Their,
That was the evidence of their faith.
okay, their faith manifested hope that you're right.
Not looking to the past.
Not looking to the past, but to the future. Okay, yes, but...
Well, like, how much more should we have faith having?
Okay, now we're in application. Okay, you're right. How much more should we have faith? But let's just stay with them. Just think about this. You guys are literally dancing around it. And it's just, I'll just say it. They died in faith. No matter what they went through, up to and including they're on their deathbed and they died believing and they never saw the promise, but they still died in faith. There wasn't a point where they said, you know what, I'm on my deathbed. I know it. I hear the death rattle. And they're not even able to speak anymore, right? They're just dying, and they never saw the promise happen, not once. But they still believed. That's what is the point. So no matter what, up to and including even death. And again, then we can go with you, Katie, of how much more should we? But the hard reality is we realize that we suck. That's a good theological term right there. We spend half our life doubting when in fact God has given us these promises. And that's what he's trying to, you can see, remember, don't lose sight of what's happening in Hebrews. He's got a ton of men and women who are starting to doubt, and they're starting to lose faith. And so he's drawing all of these people from their background. Every Jew loved and respected Sarah and Abraham. And he's drawn from them because he wants them to say, look, they never even saw, and you have seen, and he's come, the risen Christ. Does that make sense? And so believe. God accepted them because their faith was resting in him. And so we too should then hold fast to the promises, even if we don't see. He says, behold, I'm coming quickly, or coming soon, right? Well, that's been 2,000 years. Exactly how does he define quickly? Because that's not how I define quickly. Yeah, God's quickly is not our quickly, which is true, and that preaches good, but that still doesn't make it easy when you're like, you could come today, because tomorrow I'm supposed to be executed, and I really am not looking forward to the execution, right? And that's where it has to be, but we struggle with that. We struggle with that, just simply trusting that God is going to do it. But think about how many men and women maybe you've had the privilege of knowing who died in faith, having never seen the return of their Lord. And yet the Bible promises when you die, you're going to be brought into his presence. We just get lost in that. Why?
So, having seen them and greeted them from afar, is that, what's the subject of that?
Which verse?
Still in 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. The people saw the promises and greeted them from afar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the them is referring to the promises.
Oh, them. Them is the promises.
Yes.
Promises from afar, okay.
Question? Mort? Or that's a stretch?
God has something better.
Yes, he had something better. And they had to be content with that, even though they had this wonderful land that, this is pretty good. We'd be happy here. And he's like, yeah, no, you're not. You're not going to get that. I want you to remember something we say. In fact, let me bring up a script. You don't have any of the scripts on your computer right now, do you? Okay, hang on. You don't even know. Do you even know what I'm talking about right now?
Lord's Supper?
Yeah, the Lord's Supper. Oh, come on, dummy. Show me patience. Hang on. I'm old. Okay, so I just wanted to make certain they didn't corrupt this. Nope, that's not it. I'm sorry, now I'm stuck on it, so I'm not going to be able to think without getting it off my mind. Luke 22. He says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I say again, I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. What's going on, and part of what the Lord's Supper is reminding us, is that this cup that we drink and the bread that we eat, that we do it without him. He's there, he's present, right? But he's not there present in person. And yet he promises that in the kingdom we will. And so part of what the Lord's Supper is designed to do is to remember that and to revive your hope, so that no matter how bad the day or the week has been, you gather together at the first day of the week, and you gather on a Sunday because that's the day that to remember the resurrection of our Lord. And then we remember him in the Lord's Supper. And remember, not only did he resolve the issue that keeps us from God, our sin, but that he has also promised that he will sit and eat with us on that day, and that's that forward looking. Does that make sense? Okay, so back to Hebrews. Let me get back to my notes. Okay, so then we have the offering of Isaac in verses 17 through 19. Are we getting any questions on our... No? They're all bored?
Just a question from the question and answer, but you were done.
Oh, well, what was the question in the question and answer?
From Tony B's,
Oh, who did Christ wrestle with? I'll answer Tony B's. Yeah, Jacob. Who did I just say? Oh, yeah, no. Who? Yeah, it was Christ. It was a Christology. It was actually pre-incarnate Christ that he wrestled with. Which always, again, that's another one of those. I'd like more information, please. Yeah. Okay, so we're looking at verses 17 to 19. I'll read them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And I need you to listen very carefully as I read this. Follow the logic, okay, because I'm going to ask you to put it in your own words. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called, and he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. So, take me through Abraham's thinking.
I give up my son because I know I'm going to get him back.
That is a lot cleaner than how I was going to say it, but yeah, I'm going to give up my son because I know I'm going to get him back. That's beautifully said. That's beautifully said. I'll give my more clumsy way, okay? He reasons Isaac's the promised son, but the greater promise is that through this son, what was he going to do? He's going to make a great nation, his descendants, right? You got to be alive if you're going to do that. That requires his son to grow, marry, and procreate, but that's not going to happen because if he's dead, God just told me to kill my son, but God is faithful to his promises. So, if he's telling me to kill the son that he said is a promise through which the nation will arise, then when I kill him, he's going to have to raise him back, which is what you said. And that, beloved, is just amazing faith. Right? That's a man who is so convinced that God is faithful to his promises that when then he gives something else that is like that, He's able to literally stop can you just think through the emotions that are going on there and say, well, wait a second here. I still know who God is. And by the way, most of the time in pastoral counseling, what you're trying to do is get people to, when they're frantic, and just to stop for a second, just slow down, take a breath, and let's think about this, because God is still present in this trial, but all you see is the bad news or whatever it is, and your life is coming to an end as you know it. But God is still faithful, so you got to slow people down. This is the whole point of verses 3 and 6 too. Faith is a way a believer looks at life and interprets reality and even history. When you have eyes that are trained to believe, you begin to look at everything around you differently. Okay? If I talk about this a lot, but I do it because Christ talks about it a lot. When he talks about, do not store up your treasure on earth, where the moths and the rust and the thieves destroy, but store it up in heaven, right? And then he talks about that whole chapter in chapter 6 of Matthew. He's emphasizing the fact that you have to believe there is a heaven, and you also have to believe that somehow you're able to store your treasure for yourself. He doesn't say store up your treasure for somebody else. It's for you in heaven that you're able to do that. He also wants you to understand that you are not to fret over the things like, where am I going to sleep? How am I going to eat? How am I going to clothe myself? He says, your Father knows you need all of those things. You just be busy seeking first his righteousness. And we keep hearing that, and we keep changing that to something else. And I'm not trying to rant on it, but the whole point of that passage is faith. You're either going to believe God has you or he doesn't. You're either going to believe his word or you're not. But you have to do it. And this is why finances and money and wealth is such an indicator of one's heart. And it's just a huge issue that Christ draws out. So Abraham shows us how his faith in God's faithfulness allows him to interpret other things. Pretty crazy. Then in verses 20 to 22, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So, Grayson, can you read that? What?
You missed Esau.
Well, he's not in there.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. Yeah, but he...
By faith, Isaac.
He blazed Jacob and Esau, okay, but Esau's not the point.
No, I was just saying that you missed his name.
I haven't read it. I've only read my notes, which say Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Goodness. Now, Grayson, read it, and now we'll hear his name. 20 to 22. Yeah, and Esau, we all heard it.
Even regarding things to come. By faith Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of his sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel, and gave orders concerning his bones.
Okay. I was going to ask you what the point is, but I determined that it was probably one of those where we'll fumble around and then I'll end up telling you. So I'm just going to tell you the point. What he's referencing here is at what part of, hang on here. At what point in Isaac's life did he bless Jacob and Esau? When he was about to die, right? At what point in the life of Jacob did he bless the sons? Before he died. And then at what point is Joseph making this mention of his bones?
When he was dying.
Hang on. Well, too late. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say the same thing as the others, and I'm like,
It was that, though, is at his death, as he was dying. In all three of these things, they acted and they blessed with faith. They believed that these things were going to come to pass. So Isaac passed on the blessing, not to Esau, who was supposed to have it, but Jacob. And then Jacob, when he's dying, passed it on. And then Joseph, when he's dying, he is so convinced that Israel's going to leave the land that he says, I want you to remember, take my bones. How long later was that?
400.
Yeah, about 400 years. How many years have we been a nation? 250 now? See, I'm perpetually thinking we're 200 because at some point in my life we hit our 200th anniversary. Yeah, so 250. So almost twice that. And they go find his bones. First of all, that's pretty impressive. So he must have told them, look, when you bury me here, put the sign up, just keep telling everybody, because I expect my bones to be taken with you on. Oh, yeah. Fire drill or bone drills. Yeah. Yeah. Everyone's clattering their pants. Oh, it's another bone drill. Go find his bones. That's awesome. No. But I personally have a soft spot for old Joseph. There's a lot of faith for him to be so convinced that he's like, and don't forget my bones. I don't want to be buried here. That's a man who was convinced that what was not his home. Egypt. Yeah. I mean, his whole life he lived there. He did amazing things there, but he's like, this is not my place. I don't want to be here. Take me with you and put me in the land of promise. That's just faith.
And he named his son Jewish names.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And he was second in command as an Egyptian.
Yes. Named his sons Jewish names, the whole thing. It just, the whole point again, faith, right? Then we come to the Mosaic. What time? Oh. You know what? Let's stop here. I don't want to get into the Mosaic area. I keep thinking we're going to get through chapter 11 quick, but we're not. I'd rather stop and go home a little early than make you stay late. And so we'll end here with the Mosaic era, and I'll close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed, okay? So, Father, thank you for this time again, for all of us to be reminded that we are called to be men and women, whether we're young or old, of faith, but that our faith is to rest not in our own abilities, but in your faithfulness. And let us be more like Abraham. Let's trust you even when we don't see, and let us press forward. Give us grace as we go home. Let us enjoy the rest that you grant to us as you see fit. We rejoice in your mercies through Christ. In your Son's name, amen.